The kitchen was my sanctuary. And my prison. Steam wrapped around me like a blanket. I couldn't throw off. Hot and unforgiving. The sink gurgled. Knives sang against the cutting board. And the line cooks called orders like prayers. My hands moved on muscle memory tray to sink. Scrub. Stack while my mind ran through recipes I'd never have time to make. I kept my head down because looking up meant seeing them, the diners in the dining room who smelled of cologne and confidence. Who ordered and commented and left without ever noticing, the people who made the world around them work. I was the invisible machinery that kept the clock ticking. I used to imagine a different life. Culinary school had been my map, the one I'd drawn with trembling, hopeful ink. There were photos of me then, beaming in a white coat. A future, spelled out in neat courses, and glowing recommendations. Life had other plans. My father's diagnosis pulled me back to Ohio, then dragged me under. I sent every spare dollar north, and learned to find comfort in the rhythm of chopping. Because rhythm was something I could control, when everything else was slipping away. That evening moved like every other. Until it didn't. I was at the pass. Towels draped over my shoulder. Fingers pruned from hours of hot water. When the dining room changed, there was a subtle lowering of the air. Like a storm that arrives without thunder. Conversations thinned. A hush slid across the tables, like a velvet curtain. I kept my head down. Because that's what you do when you're at the bottom of the ladder, blend into the steam and metal. Then his voice cut through the noise. Soft as smoke. Look at me when you speak. I froze. I hadn't been aiming to speak to him. I wasn't supposed to be noticed. But there was something authoritative in that quiet. Something that made everyone else step back without thinking. I looked up. He sat at the head of a table, like a man placed into a painting. Perfect posture. Tailored suit. Hair, dark as a secret. His eyes were the kind of color you don't expect to see on a person. They held amber. Like something burned and beautiful. He smiled, as though I'd told the only joke he'd been waiting for all week. Il fait mes cheeks fleur. Your napkin. Sire. I said. Because that's what you say. And because the words are small and safe. Thank you. He murmured. And the tone wrapped around me, in a way that made me breathe too loud. Then, more casually, he asked. Do you always look so exhausted? It was not a question posed for small talk. It was a scalpel. Something in how he said it made my hands go cold. People didn't ask that here. People ordered and complimented, and left. They didn't see me. He saw me. No. I heard myself reply. It tasted like a lie, and like truth, all at once. I was 26 and I looked 36. The kitchen had a way of polishing away youth, and polishing in grit. I adjusted the stack of napkins. Fingers trembling because attention is its own pressure. He said my name as if it were a secret. He'd been given. Elena. He repeated. Savoring the sound. I don't know why. But his voice made it feel both foreign and true. He asked for water. Na ice. Simple things. Framed like favors from another world. After he left, the staff whispered. Do you know who that is? Marco hissed. Voice low enough. Only for me. He didn't. No one like me keeps track of people like him. But the way the other servers watched the door told me he carried power with him like an invisible weight. It should have ended there. It didn't. Outside. The night made the city sharp, neon and cold. I wrapped my thin coat around myself and started the walk home. 15 blocks is a small distance, unless you're counting every dollar. I kept my hands in my pockets. Keys clenched between fingers like a talisman. That's when a black car eased beside me. Windows darkened to the point of secrecy. My pace slowed. The door opened, and a man, one of his men, stepped out. Big. broad. Miss Elena, he said. Oddly gentle for a shadow. Mr. Moretti would like to offer you a ride. I said no. I meant no. But he slid into the pavement, like a promise I was too tired to refuse. The man in the back seat lifted his head, and the world rearranged. He was not what I expected. He was worse, and better, and everything in between. He knew my address. He knew my father's hospice. He knew where I'd interned. He knew. In a way that felt like reading pages I'd left face down. I know what I choose to know. He told me. And there was a casual finality to it. Like the closing of a book, whose ending you haven't read yet. He handed me a card thick. Cream. The number stamped in gold. No name. No company. A single way in. I shoved it in my pocket, like contraband, and muttered a thank you that sounded like I'd swallowed a coin. The days after were a study in small torments. The card weighed something in my pocket I couldn't name. I told myself he was a curiosity, and nothing more. I told myself a lot of things. Rent notices arrived with the unapologetic patience of fate. The hospice called with updates that didn't read like hope. Each bill felt like a small hand tightening on my throat. Curiosity, like water, finds weakness and seeps in. I told myself I would call and ask for nothing. I dialed the number once. For the sound of it. Then again, because the phone felt heavy in my hand. And then once more, out of a foolish, aching hope. A voice answered, like it had been waiting for me to surrender. Luciano offered me something that made my stomach drop. A job. Chef. Not line. Not sous head of a kitchen he was building. The words felt too big for the small apartment I was renting. The salary he named sounded like air. I sifted through pride and need, and found them both thin and brittle. You don't have to decide now, he said. His voice never raised. It didn't need to. Everything he wanted happened quietly. In the span between breaths, pride argued loudly. Need whispers strategically. I listened to both, and evaded neither. I thought of my father sleeping in a room that smelled of lemon cleaner and old books. I thought of the chef's whites folded in my dresser. Still with the school's crest, I thought of the knife in the drawer, that had felt like a promise the first time I held it. 3 days passed in a montage of little defeats. I cleaned plates and washed sauce from my arms, and hesitated at the idea of changing the whole axis of my life, on the basis of a card. On the 4th day, I walked back to the spot where the black car had waited, and slid my hands into the pockets of the coat I'd worn when everything else was a question. The car was there, as though it had been carved into the night specifically for me. He was inside, waiting, as if time obeyed him too. The ride was quiet. He asked me about food, and about my grandmother's biscotti, and about a small village in Italy that had shaped 100 recipes. He listened, like he was storing me in a place he planned to visit again. There was kindness. Dangerous in its pacing. There was also a calendar in his mind that marched in ways I didn't understand. When he pulled up at a building I couldn't imagine ever entering, he turned to me and said, simply, "This is your chance." I could have driven away. I could have returned to the steam and the rhythm and my safe, suffocating anonymity. I could have gone back to being small and known. But décision, in the end, don't always feel like doing anything at all. They feel like gravity. They feel like the little tug that becomes an inevitability. I took a breath that tasted like salt and old money, and stepped out into a life that would be all at once, miracle and trap. The card in my pocket pressed like a pulse against my thigh. Some choices change everything. Some choices feel like being pulled toward a light you're not sure is safe, but are too tired to refuse. Voiceover. Some decisions don't feel like choices. They feel like gravity. The door to my new life closed behind me, with a quiet that felt deliberate, as if the world outside had been muted on purpose. The apartment smelled like citrus and new wood, and the ghost of someone else's taste. It was absurd high ceilings, wide windows that drank in the city. A kitchen, so clean it might have been sacred. The marble counters were cool under my palms. The range gleamed like a promise. It was everything I had once sketched in a notebook between classes. Everything I told myself I would make someday, if I survived the small mercies of life long enough. The staff who greeted me moved with the kind of efficiency that comes from practice and fear. They called Luciano Mr. Moretti, the way people say a name that could break them, if said wrong. They were polite, they were distant. They treated him like the weather, an invisible, unavoidable force, and they treated me like an answer to a question they had been warned not to ask aloud. That undercurrent threaded through everything, respect folded into caution, admiration braided with submission. He showed me around as if I was stepping into a home he'd always imagined. "This is your kitchen now," he said. "Create something unforgettable." His words landed like a benediction. And in the way he said them, there was both ownership and an invitation. It thrilled me and made my spine tighten at once. There's a particular intimacy to a kitchen. It's the kind of intimacy that asks nothing of you until you begin to give it everything: your patience, your memory, your stubbornness. He watched me as if I were a performance he had paid for, but not in the greedy way of an audience. His attention was precise, almost reverent. When I moved folding dough, pulling a pan from the oven, he watched the small mechanics with a hunger that made the air between us dense. The heat of the oven matched the heat that rose in my chest whenever our hands almost touched over a tray of herbs. He had a habit of leaning in at the exact moment I needed him to notice. The way someone leans into a language they love. The Vergt, we tested recipes, argued about the temper of chocolate, and whether a sauce needed lemon or vinegar to balance it. He'd taste, close his eyes, then smile in a way that made my breath hitch. He told me about his mother not like a curated footnote, but like a life shape. She'd been a chef, he said, with grease under her nails and stories in the lines of her palms. She taught him the way hands remember how to coax flavor from nothing. He spoke of her with something like worship. And when his voice wavered, I realized it was not a story told to impress, but a wound held open. Intor. I told him about my father. I told him about Ohio, smells and nights spent reading recipes by lamplight to escape the hum of the hospice machines. I told him the truth, how money disappeared into medicine, and how I stopped letting myself dream in colors, because color seemed like an expense I couldn't afford. There was a sharpness in sharing that felt dangerous, but also oddly hollowing and freeing. Vulnerability is a knife whose edge can cut both ways. It can wound you or make you new. Things shifted when he invited me to dinner at his home. The invitation came as a certainty, no question, no room for negotiation. And I accepted, because something in me wanted to see the world he'd promised up close. The house was a different kind of silence than the apartment. It was curated objects chosen not to shout. Furniture arranged to impede none of the ways power moves. He poured wine from a bottle I had never seen another soul touch. The candlelight made the room soft, and his face looked younger, less like a threat, and more like someone who had been given permission to be tender. "Since the moment I saw you," he said, voice low, as if keeping the words from scattering into the air. "You've haunted me." It was obscene and honest, and precisely what I'd been waiting not to hear. I told myself not to be flattered. I told myself that men like him said such things, the way other men bought flowers. But his admission landed inside me, like a small, sharp stone thrown into a still pond. The ripples spread until I didn't know where reason stopped and feeling began. We kissed the way people do when they finally stop pretending to be polite. Acquaintances slow and precise, and with a hunger that felt like both apology and claim. It was consuming in a way that made me forget, briefly, the costs that threaded through my life. In those moments, it was only the heat of his mouth and the feel of a man who watched you like a secret. But there was always a shadow. Pleasure in him came with a restraint that felt rehearsed. Sometimes, he would pull back and stare at me, as if measuring consequence, as if he were noting whether my soul matched the image he'd built. It made me nervous in a way I told myself was normal. When you've lived a life scabbed over by survival, the twist happened like weather changes sudden, and without fanfare. One night, as rain tapped at the windows, and Luciano said he had to attend to business, he left me alone, in his study, with a polite insistence that I stay. I told him I'd wait in the living room. He smiled and promised to be quick. He never seemed hurried. The pace of his life was a slow, terrifying machinery. My feet found the study door on their own. Curiosity, a pull stronger than caution. There was a drawer half opened, as though it had been left like a breadcrumb. I told myself I'd only glance. I told myself I'd close the folder, and put it back, and move on. My hand touched the edge, and the weight of paper came to my palm like something I hadn't expected. Reports. Photos. Notes catalogued, with a precision that made my throat tight. There were pictures of me. Not casual images, but surveillance me leaving work. Me at the corner store. Me carrying bags. There were receipts. Hospital notes. A timeline written in someone's hand that followed me like a map. And then my father's name, the name that, until that moment, had been a safe, shut room in my life. Next to it, a police report dry. Clinical. More devastating than any confession. A car crash. A woman's name. Elena. Except not Elena. A different name. A woman whose life ended when metal met pavement and breath ran out. Beneath it all, in handwriting that had exactness and cruelty, the reason was laid out like a ledger. My father had given an alibi. He had shielded someone who had escaped worse consequences because of fear, because he'd been protecting something that mattered to him, then something he'd chosen to place above the law. The thought landed like a fist. It reoriented the axis of every soft moment that had warmed me the past weeks. The offers, the apartment, the dinner. Each kindness read back now like a calculated move. Stacked up like turns in a game with someone else's life. As the board, my chest ached in the way fear and betrayal clubbed together. Luciano hadn't rescued me. He had baited me. He had engineered closeness so that a knife might sink deeper into a different place. My hands trembled. I shoved the folder back. Fingers clumsy. The sound of it too loud. I left without turning the light on. The rain outside sound like static noise in my ears as I stumbled through the hallway. The apartment small and suddenly alien. I ran until sweat chilled on my skin, and the city blurred into streaks of light. I went home to the small apartment that had felt like survival, and that night it was the only place that seemed to make sense. He came after me. The knock at my door felt like a verdict. When I opened it, he was standing there, no pretense. No driver. Just him. There was something in the way he regarded me that was less predator than broken and more dangerous for its rawness. Was any of it real, I asked? My voice cracked on the last word. His face was a map of decisions. He said, quietly, it was supposed to be revenge. Until I met you. There was an honesty in the admission that was like an ungloved hand on a tender place. The confession didn't heal anything. It exposed the wound. He told me about her, his mother, how she taught him tenderness, in the same kitchen I now owned. He explained the lie that had been told to him about that night. The blank spot that had been filled with anger and grief, and a need to see justice done. He explained my father's name. The way it had been a latch he'd turned with a slow clinical efficiency of someone who had sharpened vengeance into a trade. I wanted to believe him. The wish for belief was heavier in me than the evidence that my life had been manipulated. You played me, I said. The word small, and yet like throwing stones. You made me part of your plan. He didn't argue. He didn't try to dress his actions in high-minded words. Instead, he held up a hand like someone attempting to stop a storm. I wanted him to feel what I felt. He said, but meeting you was different. Different didn't erase what had been done. Different didn't take back the nights I'd slept, thinking I owed something to a man who had been orchestrating the strings of my life. The thing about betrayal is that it makes your skin thin. Even apologies stick to you in a way they shouldn't. We both stood there, in the small geometry of my kitchen, framed by cups and dishes that had never known this level of complication. He reached for me, and I recoiled. He asked me to talk. I told him I didn't want to be a pawn. He said he understood. There was no neat resolution. Only a hollowing honesty that pulsed between us, an admission that his revenge had been the scaffolding of something that had become, by accident or fate, real. I left him at the door that night with words that were not forgiveness. I left him with a door shut between us, and a rain that wouldn't let my thoughts settle. When I lay down on the narrow mattress in my apartment, I realized that the world had tilted. Nothing would be simple again. Love, it turned out, arrived like a weapon and like a balm. It could save you and it could cut you. He drove to Ohio, like a man, carrying a verdict. The city slid by in a grey ribbon outside the car window, and every mile felt like a sentence being read aloud. I didn't expect him to go, at least not that quickly. Revenge. He told me. Had patience. It had plans. Yet the thing about plans is they can break when someone shows you exactly what you've been breaking in the name of them. The hospice smelled the same as the first time I'd walked in lemon cleaner and old books. The soft mechanical sigh of machines keeping rhythm, with breaths that wouldn't always stay. My father's face was smaller than I remembered in person. The years of illness, folding the angles into gentler things. He looked at Luciano, like a man drawn into a history that had nothing to do with him. Eyes wary and soft at the same time. It was humiliating. Watching my father be gentle to a stranger, who had every right by right of hurt, to be anything but gentle in return. Luciano sat with him. And he listened. He listened the way the sea listens to the shore, relentless and inevitable. My father stumbled through details. He hadn't spoken out loud in years. Memories that were less about legal facts, and more about the throbbing, living fear of a man who'd loved with a coward's hands. He told the truth, not the clean courtroom truth, but the messy human one. There had been an affair. There had been a woman named Lucia, who cooked in a tiny test kitchen above a restaurant, and who loved with reckless, soft force. There had been a man, Alessandro, whose temper ran like a current under everything. A man whose violence trembled the edges of the lives around him. My father had lied, not because he wanted to shield a criminal, he said with a voice that had paper-thin edges, but because he'd been protecting a life, her life from a man who would have destroyed her for the truth. He'd taken a choice that haunted him every day, to be complicit in a lie that eased immediate danger, but carved out a long-term injury for others. He hadn't made the choice out of malice. He'd made it out of fear, and love, and the desperate, private calculus of a man who had to pick which soul he could try to save. Listening to that, Luciano's face did something I hadn't seen before. Rage thinned into something like shock, and then into a kind of grief that had nowhere to land. The whole scaffolding he'd built, his careful, patient revenge, was not being dismantled so much as being shown its seams. He had been punishing a ghost. Or worse. Several ghosts. The woman he'd loved in memory had been living a life as complicated as anyone. The man he'd blamed was not merely a monster in a file. My father was not a villain in the way he had imagined. He had been a frightened, foolish, loving man who had tried to shield what he could. That realization did something dangerous. It made him mortal in our eyes. It made the revenge smaller, more human, and therefore more devastating. Destroying me had been a way to make the pain equal, to replace the aching loss with the satisfaction of a returned ledger. But when ledger met living people, when it met my father's small, trembling admissions, and the photograph of Lucia smiling, the arithmetic broke. He left the hospice with a look I have no language for, hollow, soft, like someone who'd been carrying a blade and heard it clatter to the floor, and realized it had been cutting them too. He didn't speak of courtrooms or punishment after that. Punishment, e discovered, had a cost he hadn't accounted for. It had the cost of the thing he had wanted most, the possibility of a life that was not defined by anger, and so his reparation began in quiet places. First, there was a letter I found months later at the hospice, anonymous, unsigned. A sum calculated not to announce itself, but to heal what it could. Staff with tired shoes and gentle hands received new funding for night nursing and memory care. He gave, without ceremony, to the people who had been keeping my father's life steady. It was an action that said what his words could not yet admit, that he wanted to fix what he could. Privately, without applause. Then there was the restaurant. He arranged things so that the ownership transferred quietly, deliberately, into my name. He called it a practical decision. At first someone had to be the public face, but the papers were full of little choices that read like, apologies, my name embroidered on the coat, my recipes honored, my grandmother's biscotti, listed as a tribute. He could have kept it all, and simply chosen to step back. Instead, he chose to give me the place where I had learnt to be visible again. It was not an erasure of the past. It wasn't intended to be. It was an offer, a place that belonged to me, with the ghosts acknowledged, but not allowed to be the architects of my life. When he finally left, he did it the way some men do hard things, without fanfare, without a speech that might make me feel I owed him forgiveness as a debt. He wrote me a note and left it under the place setting at a small table where we'd once eaten in silence and company. I found the paper folded into my palm like something fragile. For once, it read, in handwriting that was more careful than any of his earlier messages. I wanted to build something beautiful, not destroy it. There was no pleading in the line. No demand. Only a truth. He was, at last, willing to own. He disappeared from my life, in the way a tide withdraws. Leave no footprints. Leave no festival of remnant. I don't know if he meant to be a test, or a lesson, or simply a man who needed to step back. I only know what happened to me next. 6 weeks later, I stood in a kitchen that smelled like basil and clean linen. The heat from the range, a small, familiar comfort that didn't try to be anything more than it was. The restaurant's name had been chosen quietly, Lucia's. It was a dedication and a question, both the name of the woman whose life had tangled ours together, now given a life of its own in the form of a place where people fed their bodies and, sometimes, their souls. Forgiveness, I had learned, was not a tidy trade. It didn't mean forgetting or absolving. It meant acknowledging the person behind the harm, the frightened decisions, the flawed heroism, the choices made from a place that was not purely evil. It meant seeing that people are rarely only their worst acts, and that sometimes love and fear make strange, tragic bedfellows. The opening night was crowded, in the gentle way that success on the surface can be clinking glasses. Polite applause. Friends and strangers, testing a menu for the first time. I moved through the kitchen, with the muscle memory of someone who had rebuilt herself out of salt and oil and small, patient victories. The staff were mine now in a way that felt steadier. They looked at me with the sort of respect that is earned, and not given. From across the dining room, by the pillar, where he had once stood in 1,000 forms, He watched. He was not announced. Not introduced. He stood like a shadow at the edge of light. And we met each other there. No words. Only a nod that contained everything we hadn't spoken. There was no sweeping reconciliation. No Hollywood froth of last-minute speeches. There was simply the understanding that people change when the truth is laid before them, and when they choose, finally, to respond with something that resembles humanity. His eyes held something softer than desire, remorse. Perhaps. And a hope I didn't have language enough to claim for him. I returned to the stove. I tasted the sauce, and added a pinch of salt, because the work required it. The room hummed around me with noise and warmth, and a life that I had fought to pull back from the edges of despair. Forgiveness. I told myself quietly as I plated the first dish with hands steady now. Is not forgetting, it's choosing. Again and again. To see the person behind the pain. He stayed long enough to watch the restaurant fill. And then he left the way he had come, quiet. Deliberate. Gone. The note remained folded in the pocket of my coat, like a small relic I carried, not as proof of anything, but as a reminder that some people are capable of being repaired. If they choose it, the rest is left to time and to the slow, stubborn work of living a life you can be proud of. In spite of the tracks left by those who came before you. And in the end, as the kitchen lights dimmed, and the last guest smiled their goodbyes, I found myself thinking of Lucia, her hands covered in flour. Her laugh like a bell. I thought of my father and his small, cowardly acts of love that had cost more than he ever imagined. I thought of the man who had tried to make me the centerpiece of his revenge, and instead learned how to build. We keep walking. We cook. We choose every day what kind of lives we'll stitch from the scraps and the silks. Some stories stay with you not because they're perfect, but because they remind you that, even in the darkest places, we can still choose light. If Elena and Luciano's journey moved you even just a little, don't forget to hit that like button. It tells the algorithm this story was worth feeling. Subscribe for more dark love stories, redemption arcs, and cinematic storytelling, where love isn't easy, but always real. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Do you think people like Luciano deserve redemption? Or are some scars too deep to heal? Share this story with someone who believes in second chances. And I'll see you in the next chapter.